Hello, welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that it is believed approximately 20,000 years ago, humans crossed a land bridge where the Bering Strait is today to begin to inhabit the American continents? And that Leif Erikson was the first European to land in the New World, not Christopher Columbus. That Georgia was originally found as a pauper's colony to provide protection between the other 12 English colonies and Spanish Florida. And that the Townshend Acts only brought in about 260 pounds to the British Empire, while it cost over 170,000 pounds to enforce it. Did you remember all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will talk about that and more in episode 51, Units 1 and 2 review. Because let's not pretend like we actually remember all this stuff. All right, and welcome into episode 51, which, as I mentioned in the intro, is a review, a Units 1 and 2 review. We'll be reviewing everything we've learned up to this point in episode 1 through episode 50, which I'll be breaking down into Units 1 and Units 2 for you. Unit 1 will talk about Native Americans and Conquest, the settling of the English colonies, and society and slavery in the colonies. And then after a short break, we'll hop into Unit 2, which will cover mercantilism, navigation acts, and Bacon's Rebellion, King Philip's War, the Dominion of New England, Glorious Revolution, Salutary Neglect, French and Indian War, and all of the acts that are leading up to the Revolutionary War. So, a lot of stuff to cover on this review episode. And you might be wondering, Chris, why are you reviewing Units 1 and 2 at the same time as opposed to reviewing them separately? And there's a very simple answer for that. Because I did not think of this idea of reviewing them until it was too late. So, moving forward, we'll be splitting up the reviews based on each individual unit, but this one will be a bit longer because we'll be reviewing both. So, starting all the way back at the beginning of what we have learned so far in this podcast, and I might even mention a few new things on this podcast, on this episode that you haven't heard yet before. About 20,000 years ago, Siberian hunters likely became the first American inhabitants. So the first people to inhabit North America. 14,000 years ago, it is believed, so about 6,000 years later, that humans eventually reached the tip of South America. Now, these Paleo-Indians did not suffer from many of the communicative diseases because they were so spread out. They weren't really living on top of each other or living in as close of quarters as Native Americans were when we start talking about the colonization of America by Europe. These Native Americans came to North America through a land bridge called Beringia, basically where the Bering Strait is today. There were so many glaciers that it sucked up the water and created a strait of land where you could cross into North America, and that's exactly what they did. Now, when these North Americans when they explored throughout North America, they likely had an abundant supply of food. And what they did is that they overhunted and caused the extinction of many large animal species, such as the mammoth, the mastodon, camel, and even the horse. Now, climatic warming probably played a bigger role in the extinction of these animals than the Native Americans, but certainly Native Americans and their overhunting contributed to that. During this time, Native Americans experienced an agricultural revolution in which they shifted from hunter-gatherers to basic crops, which of course allowed them to become much more sedentary and spend much more of their time focusing on increasing technology and becoming more productive. And this technology increase was evident, at least has been evident with historians and archaeologists and anthropologists who study Native Americans during this time. As I mentioned, I believe in episode 1, there was a city, more or less, in present-day Illinois called Cahokia, which is believed to have had upwards of 20,000 people. And we also mentioned Tenochtitlan in present-day Mexico City, which was populated by the Aztecs and was just an incredible city at that time, highly organized social and political structure. Bernal Diaz de Castillo, who was actually one of the conquistadors with Hernan Cortez, said, quote, "When we saw all those Aztec towns and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, and that straight level causeway leading to Mexico, we were astounded. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was all a dream." Towards the Atlantic coast of North America, you have the eastern woodland Indians, where they had agriculture supplemented by hunting and gathering. And then you also had the Great Plains Indians, which were primarily hunters and gatherers. And you had the Anasazi in the southwest, and like I mentioned, the Aztecs in Mesoamerica. Now, there were significant threats to survival for Native Americans, and as the Europeans began to settle in the New World, Native Americans became very eager for European trade. They eventually became dependent upon it, and unfortunately, in many instances, became indebted to the Europeans and gave up significant leverage. And over the years, what many of them did is they changed their daily living habits to the point where they were wholly dependent upon the Europeans and their trade goods. Now, something that we mentioned in episode 2, Zach and I know we are only through one episode now, but trust me, we'll pick up the pace significantly, it wasn't episode 2, it was episode 4, I believe, and that was an extra credit on the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange were diseases brought over from Europe during the settlement of the New World. And of course, this happened because of the lack of resistance that Native Americans had to epidemic disease, things such as smallpox, the measles, and influenza. And in some areas, the death rate was believed to be as high as 90 to 95% in some regions of North America. On the other side of the ocean, you had Africa, which had a diversity of sub-Saharan cultures. Much of West Africa believed in Islam, and they have strong traditional beliefs centered around the family structure. And the Portuguese were the first to navigate Africa, and they were primarily looking for slaves and gold. And these African soldiers who would kidnap other fellow Africans would sell them, especially the prisoners of war, to the Europeans as slaves. So, how many slaves were really sent to the New World? Well, in the 17th century, there were about 1,000, so this is the 1600s, so about 1,000 African slaves were sent per year. In the 1700s, there were over 5 million transported to the Americas. And by 1860, right at the cusp of the outbreak of the Civil War, there were over 11 million African American slaves, or I should say African slaves, many of them. Before 1831, more Africans came to North America than Europeans. So just think about how big of an impact Africans and African Americans will have in future discussions, especially when we're talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and it will be a cloud looming over these negotiations moving forward, and the dark cloud being that the Founding Fathers were not willing to directly deal with the horrors of slavery. So, let's jump into European conquest. As I mentioned in one of our early episodes, in 984 AD, Erik the Red founded Greenland. Leif Erikson, Erik the Red's son, founded Vinland in the New World. Once again, Leif Erikson was the first European to land in the New World, not Christopher Columbus. Now, why was Europe thinking of expanding during the 1400s? Well, you had a rise of nation-states, a spread of new technologies, and a spread of old knowledge. And what was happening is many of these nation-states and these countries that were being taken over by monarchs, it was more or less an arms race, and that arms race was driven by trade. Well, Christopher Columbus in 1492, of course, went to many different countries trying to tell them that he thought he had a water route to Cathay, or what was, China, basically. And the Spanish actually took him up on it. Now, why did Spain do this? Well, Spain had become the first European nation to achieve really the conditions that were necessary for successful colonization. They become unified under Ferdinand and Isabella. And in 1492, the same year that Christopher Columbus set sail, the Jews and the Muslims were expelled from Spain. Now that this civil fighting was over, Ferdinand and Isabella were anxious to look elsewhere to see if they could build up their power, their prestige, and of course, their wealth. This will give rise to conquistadors, men like Hernando Cortez and Francisco Pizarro, who head to the New World purely to plunder and to gain wealth and power. And some of the major critics of Christopher Columbus like to lump him in with that group also. The conquest of the Canary Islands provided a dress rehearsal, so to speak, for colonization of the New World. Throughout the 15th century, Spain had profited off of the Canary Islands, and they are off of the west coast of Spain, forcefully subjugating the natives and taking advantage of the land. As we all know, in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he made a few different voyages to the New World, initially landing in Hispaniola, and one of the great controversies of history was whether or not he actually knew for a fact he had landed in a totally new and unknown continent. And still no one to this day can tell 100% for sure whether or not he knew. But many believe that by his death he had at least realized it or had a very strong suspicion of it. Christopher Columbus and his discoveries, of course, made possible Spanish domination in the Americas. And while Spain was landing in this new world and coming back to Europe and telling everyone about it, the Portuguese, the original mariner power in Western Europe, began to complain, saying that, oh, no, we've been to these lands. We know exactly where you're coming from, even though they didn't. These lands are ours. So what they decided to do is they decided to draw a line of demarcation, so to speak, in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was a line drawn to split up the land in the West. Now, this split the land between the Western Hemisphere pretty much a few hundred miles west of the eastern border of Brazil, eastern coast of Brazil, and Portugal laid claim to the land to the east. Well, little did they know that there was an entire continent to the west that now could be claimed by Spain, but as we know, with French and English colonization of the New World, other European powers did not really pay much attention to any of this. Now, I've mentioned a couple times America, and how did it get the name America? And this is a question that was posed for the Q&A. It was posed a day or two too late, so we weren't able to cover it, but I want to cover it real quickly here. So Amerigo Vespucci was a great explorer himself. And later in the 1490s and into the 1500s, he also explored west, and he also landed in the New World, because after Columbus came back, numerous other trips were sent over there with other men. And Amerigo Vespucci was really the first man who believed that this was not, in fact, China or the East Indies. This truly was a new world. And a German cartographer drew a map of this area based on how Vespucci described it, and he named it after him and named it America. And the name just stuck. And that's something I'll dive more into in our next Q&A, but that's the Cliff Notes version of it so far. As I mentioned, men like Hernando Cortez and Francisco Pizarro, plundered the Aztec and the Incan Empire, and the Spanish set up the encomienda system, which rewarded the conquistadors and gave them large land grants, and the Indian inhabitants were forced to provide labor for these conquistadors. And they appointed officials who were answerable really only to the crown. By 1650, 500,000 Spaniards were in the New World, and this encomienda system had set in, and there were clear social castes in the New World. The unmarried males who came over to the New World began to intermarry with the natives, and a mixed blood population emerged, and you had three basic groups of people in this mixed blood population. The first were the mulattoes, who were Europeans and a mix of European and African ancestry, the mestizos, who were part native and part European, and the criollos, who were Spanish-born, and they were Spanish ancestry, but they were born in America, which made them not, as purely Spanish. So before jumping into the colonization of the English colonies, I'd like to speak about the French here briefly. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, and the French began to find wealth in this new world, in present-day Canada, and convert the natives. Now, as we know, as we've covered, the French spread out a lot more than the English did, and they did not focus as much on colonization, but instead they focused on conversion and the fur trade. Because of that, the English populations in the New World will fly by and dwarf the French populations, which of course put France at a huge disadvantage in the French and Indian War. Now, the English began to enter this competition in the late 16th century, the late 1500s, and they did that following the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. After the English defeated the Spanish Armada, the Atlantic seemingly opened up to them and allowed them to truly entertain the idea of creating or beginning to colonize and create an empire over on the other side of the Atlantic. Now, the English had experience doing something like this, at least they believed so, in Ireland. When the English colonized Ireland, they believed that the Irish were wild and barbaric and uncivilized, and so the English colonization of Ireland, you saw the English really not barricade themselves from the Irish, but clearly separate themselves from the Irish and purposefully try not to intermingle with them. You'll see the English do this again in the New World with the Native Americans, and this is one of the reasons why there were so many issues between the English and the natives that you didn't quite see as much with the French, because the English tried to live on their land and live as separate from the Native American societies as they possibly could. You may remember that in the late 1500s, 1584, and then again in 1587, the colony of Roanoke was founded, which would be in present-day North Carolina. And without diving deep into the story, this was really the first English colony established, but it disappeared. And no one to this day really knows what happened to those lost colonists at Roanoke. We can speculate, and you can go back and listen to the episodes on Roanoke and Jamestown and hear more, but no one is really sure. What ended up happening in the early 1600s is joint stock companies were created, learning from the failures of Sir Walter Raleigh when he lost all his money on Roanoke, and men came together to pool their money to create business ventures where multiple people could invest without the risk of bankruptcy and try to colonize in this new world. In 1607, they did just that by establishing Jamestown. John Smith, who was a fairly young guy at the time, but boy, he had enough life experiences to really challenge anyone today already in his life at that point, took control of the ruling council of Jamestown in the fall of 1608 and basically established a work or get out attitude. He enlisted the help of the Powhatan, and he began to turn the colony around. But eventually John Smith had to head back to England because of an injury, a gunpowder injury, that is, it's suspected may have not been an accident. In 1612, John Rolfe began to export tobacco from Jamestown, this stinking weed, and it began to become considerably profitable after almost failing altogether a couple times. A House of Burgesses was established, and the headright system was also established, where the colonists who provided their own transportation to the New World could receive 50 acres of land. This gave rise to indentured servitude and a very clear caste system, even between the white colonists in Virginia. The colony of Maryland was the only Catholic colony in the New World, founded in 1634 by Lord Baltimore, whose real name is Cecilius Calvert, and they passed the Act of Toleration in 1649, granting religious freedom for some, but the Catholics were pushed out soon after. One of the major reasons that they allowed Protestants to settle in Maryland was because they recognized there were not enough Catholics traveling to the New World to populate the colony effectively. So they opened it up to Protestants, and Protestants soon after really took over. And of course, the Maryland Toleration Act really is a misnomer because, as we've covered in previous episodes, it was really not very tolerant at all. In 1620, the Pilgrims landed in New England on the Mayflower and established the Plymouth colony. They planned on going down to Virginia, but a storm pushed their ship off track, and that is why they decided they would write the Mayflower Compact, that along with other reasons, but to make sure that they had a covenant of how they were going to act and how they were going to rule the colony when they got off. And many historians like to quip that this was the first constitution in North America, the Mayflower Compact in 1620. With the help of men like Squanto, the Plymouth colony was able to survive, even though it had some very rough times, and of course it was famous for having the first Thanksgiving. A decade later, you saw the Great Migration of the Puritans who were coming to who wanted to purify the Church of England, and they searched for a more meaningful change to the Anglican Church. And they came over to the New World, and this is where you see a significant increase in population to the New England area. John Winthrop would lead them, and he would establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And really, this Great Migration saw colonists landing all the way up from present-day Maine all the way down to the northern border of New Jersey, with primarily them landing in the Massachusetts area. John Winthrop gave his famous City Upon a Hill speech to his followers, and they began to settle in the Massachusetts Bay Area. Two major dissenters of this time were Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. Roger Williams fled the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1636, and Hutchinson fled in 1638, both of them speaking out about the fact that the church and the state were, and they had their own separate complaints, which we've covered, but they more or less were saying the church and the state were operating hand in hand, and they believed was not as accepting and a bit too political for them, which in retrospect, probably pretty accurate. Connecticut was established in 1636, and New Haven eventually absorbed into Connecticut. Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams in 1636, and New Hampshire was eventually established in 1677. Present-day New York, which at the time was New Netherlands, was not settled by the English, but settled by the Dutch. In 1609, Henry Hudson explored the Hudson River, and 12 years later, in 1621, the Dutch established the colony of New Netherland. New Amsterdam became the capital of that colony, and this was a very diverse and profitable colony because of the trade and because of the acceptance to all different types of races and languages and creeds of people. They prided themselves on having a type of unstable pluralism. The Duke of York sent Peter Stuyvesant, who was the commander of the Dutch forces, out of Manhattan in 1666, and then had to do it again a decade later in 1674, and the English were able to take over the New Netherland colony, and they called it New York, unsurprisingly. York then grants a charter to his friends to create New Jersey. The colony of Pennsylvania was founded by the Quakers. In 1681, William Penn was given a land grant in the Americas as a repayment of debt to his family, and he traveled to the New World to escape religious persecution. As Zach and I covered in an extra credit episode, the Quakers were nicknamed the Quakers because, quote, they were those who trembled at the word of the Lord. They were members of the Society of Friends, and they were very welcoming, very accepting, and had a good relationship with Native Americans. They were pacifist, and they were excellent at both agriculture and trade. The Carolinas were settled in 1670, with much of their early population coming from Barbados, which is an island in the Caribbean which had been overcrowded, and slave owners in Barbados were looking to replicate what they had in Barbados in the new colony of Carolina. Their economy was primarily based on the Indian slave trade and rice plantations, and about 60 years after its founding in 1729, it eventually split into North and South Carolina. The last of the colonies to talk about is the colony of Georgia, founded 60 plus years after the Carolinas by James Oglethorpe. It was a pauper's colony, which means many people in Georgia were very poor or destitute and went there for a new opportunity. Some of them were criminals, and they could establish a buffer state between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida. While the colonists in New England established a family-based society where they married their extended family sometimes, or their neighbors, and they kept a close-knit community, those in the Chesapeake area and to the south established a planter-based society in which there were very clear caste systems. There was a more spread-out population, and they relied much heavier on African slavery. Speaking of African slavery, the first Africans that came to America were in 1619 in the colony of Virginia. And for the next really 50 years, the status of Africans in Virginia was pretty unclear. The African population in Virginia was rising precipitously, and this led in 1672 to stricter slave laws. Africans were defined as slaves for life. Their slave status passed on to their children. The white masters had total control over them, and the mixing of races was not tolerated. And those who were mulattoes, who were mixed between white and African ancestry, were treated the same as those who were fully from African ancestry. The massive importation of Africans from the West African coast to North and South America was known as the Middle Passage. And believe it or not, Brazil and the West Indies received a huge percentage, over 80% of all Africans who came across the Atlantic through the Middle Passage. British North America, which is present-day United States, only received about 4 or 5% of the total number, which was always really shocking when I would talk about that in class. And that does it for the Unit 1 review, and we'll be back right after this for the Unit 2 review. Hey everyone, I just wanted to tell you again about $49sites.com. That's the number $49sites.com. If you go to www.ateachershistory.com, you will see that our website is all updated and ready to go. And I could not be happier with it. It was such an easy process for me. At $49sites.com, you can have a website created and maintained for you for just $49 a month, or you can upgrade your package using the coupon code HISTORY, upgrade to the Pro package using the coupon code HISTORY, and that would really help me out. If you are a small business owner or a podcaster, entrepreneur, a blogger, if you know someone who is looking to upgrade their website and not spend so much time and energy on maintaining their website and keeping it up to date, then go to $49sites.com, use the coupon code HISTORY, and enjoy. I promise you will not be disappointed. One more thing to note, we will be launching a Patreon page. Hopefully that will be up. I mentioned in episode 50 it would be up by now, but we're still working on a couple small things, and we're hoping that will be up any day now. So for episode 52, I will be able to announce the launching of our Patreon page, and I'll be giving you more details on that next week. Your interest in the podcast really means the world to us, and we're really excited about where this podcast is going and the amount of people who are genuinely taking interest in learning about the history of the United States. All right, now let's get back to the review, and we will pick up with Unit 2. So now that we have the Spanish, the French, and the English colonizing the New World here, and the English beginning to really colonize the New World with the 13 colonies they've established, what will begin to be created is a system of mercantilism, in which England will use the colonies for profit. The idea of mercantilism is that one country's gain is another country's loss. The countries gain control of the world's scarce resources as much as they possibly can. So what was happening is that the colonies were sending over raw materials, and then England would turn them into finished products and send them back to the colonies, and the colonies would then pay for those finished products and send over more raw materials. And England was accumulating more and more wealth throughout this process. The Navigation Acts of, 1660, so way before the acts really began to pick up a century later. But the Navigation Act of 1660 began to put structure around this idea of mercantilism to make sure that England could profit as much as it possibly could off of the colonies. It said a few different things, such as ships had to be engaged in English colonial trade, and if they had to be made in England, and they had to carry a crew of at least 3/4 English men, and enumerated goods such as tobacco, sugar, cotton, indigo, ginger, etc., had to go into only English ports. What this did is this encouraged shipbuilding in England. It made it very hard for rivals to get certain goods from the colonies, and it generated a lot more revenue for the crown. Of course, to implement these acts, they had to, England's gain is someone's loss, right? And many of the planters and New England merchants were hurt by these acts, because what they realized is that the Dutch were pretty much removed from this colonial trade. The English then updated the Navigation Acts in 1673 and began to tighten loopholes around the merchants and the farmers who were dealing with smuggled goods. While England was tightening the screws on profiting off of their colonial trade, you saw both natives and colonists alike begin to push back against the ruling powers in the colonies. With Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 and King Philip's War in 1675 in New England. About a decade after King Philip's War, King James II established the Dominion of New England and appointed Edmund Andros to be governor, who ruled pretty tyrannically. Edmund Andros famously said, quote, "You have no more privileges left you than not be sold for slaves." The purpose of the Dominion of New England was to consolidate power under the king in New England and make it much easier to control. It eventually split up in 1691, but the lasting impact of it was power was beginning to be determined in England based on land and wealth, not necessarily your role in the church. With this came increased suspicion over those who were turning towards capitalism and trying to gain wealth through business and trade. And of course, with every revolution, there is a counter-revolution. And this counter-revolution in New England showed itself in the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692, in which there was a panic in Salem, Massachusetts, with young girls claiming to be controlled by witches. The court allowed spectral evidence, which isn't evidence at all. In fact, it is just you can claim that you're being controlled or haunted by someone's ghost. It's really just a bunch of garbage, but it worked. And the Salem witchcraft trials were a black eye in colonial history for sure. In 1689, England experienced the Glorious Revolution. The king was overthrown, and William and Mary took over. At this point, what begins to happen is that England will loosen its controls on the colonies. So if we think about the cause and effect here in the colonies, if you can begin to track with me, is the cause, the original cause. So if we track back to the beginning of Unit 2, right, the original cause of mercantilism is that there's increased competition in Europe, and England wanted to make more money. The effect of that increased competition led to mercantilism. The effect of mercantilism led to a severe trade imbalance in the colonies. The effect of the severe trade imbalance in the colonies led to colonial smuggling, which of course led to the Crown looking to crack down by passing updated navigation acts and creating the Dominion of New England. In 1689, you had the Glorious Revolution, in which the king was overthrown, William and Mary came into power, and the effect we see in the colonies is salutary neglect, in which the Crown took a more hands-off approach to running the colonies. As long as they were profitable and they were peaceful, there was really no need for William and Mary to get too involved. What will begin to happen in the late 1600s is that the colonists will begin to experience year after year, generation after generation, more and more freedom and self-government because of the more lax policies placed on them by England. And keep in mind at this time, the 13 colonies were not just full of English settlers. And there were many English settlers stretching from present-day North Carolina all the way up to present-day Maine. But there were huge numbers of African and Scots-Irish in present-day South Carolina and in Georgia. There were many Scots-Irish throughout the Shenandoah Valley along the Appalachian Mountains, and also Scottish living on the borders of South Carolina and North Carolina. Of course, the Hudson River Valley was totally covered by Dutch, and you had Africans living along the coast in the Carolinas, Virginia, and Maryland. So when we look at the structure of colonial society as we move through the 1700s now, there was pretty striking ethnic and racial diversity. Over half of the population was under 21 years old. There's a relatively high per capita GDP in the colonies, and the wealth was unevenly distributed. As we've covered in detail, in the 1750s, the colonists in Virginia and Maryland and some in Pennsylvania began to explore west into the Ohio River Valley and came into conflict with the French. George Washington, unintentionally, more or less, started a world war, which is known in America as the French and Indian War and in Europe as the 7 Years' War. The English and the French fought for 9 years in America over control of not just the Ohio River Valley, but more or less all of the continental North America. As you know, we covered this war in great detail over, I believe, 6 or 7 episodes with a couple extra credits, and the English ended up being victorious in 1763. Kicking the French out once and for all of present-day United States and taking control of those colonies and beginning to expand west. During the war, there began to be a breakdown of political trust between the colonists and the British, even if slightly. In 1760, King George III ascended to the throne, and despite his limited ability, he wanted to take a more active role in government. He was a difficult man to deal with and will go through bouts of seeming insanity throughout his reign, and we'll talk more about that when we cover the Revolution in more detail. And during this war, what English officials began to realize is it was hard for Parliament to get adequate information on the colonies from the king. They demanded, or wanted to demand, parliamentary sovereignty. in which English officials assumed that Parliament must have the ultimate authority over this new king. As we will see following the war, the colonists will try to reserve internal colonial authority for their own colonial legislatures. Remember, they had just been dealing with about 70 years of salutary neglect in which they had, at least in limited ways, self-government in the colonies, and they were not interested in more oversight by the crown. And some of them began to talk about wanting representation in Parliament. But Britain argued that they had representation, they had virtual representation, meaning that since they were English citizens and since Parliament was made up of English citizens, Parliament looked out for their interest just as much as anyone else's, and they had no specific claim to seats in Parliament just because they were on the other side of the ocean. But colonists insisted that only colonial representatives should be ones that represented the colonies. Following the French-Indian War, in 1763, King George passed the Proclamation of 1763, which more or less drew a line over, an imaginary line over the Appalachian Mountains, dividing the land to the east of the mountains, which was mostly the 13 colonies at this time, to the land to the west. They did not have the money, the energy, or the time to fight with Native Americans, and they did not want the colonists expanding west too quickly and getting themselves into trouble and creating a war with the natives. But they didn't need to wait for that because Pontiac, a native leader in 1763, tried to galvanize many of the native tribes along the Proclamation line of 1763 and throughout many forts in the Midwest, and began to force a rebellion. This rebellion was eventually crushed, but it showed that the Native Americans were not particularly happy to be living with a bunch of colonists now ruled by England, because they were far more favorable to the French than the English, based on how the two people had treated them. In 1764, a year after the Proclamation line of 1763, the acts and the taxes begin to roll in. With the Sugar Act being passed in 1764, the Stamp Act being passed and then being passed in 1765 and then eventually repealed, only to lead to the Townshend duties. Throughout all of this, the colonists were protesting and demanding, not all colonists, of course, but the more radical colonists were demanding that they should not be taxed for anything without their consent. And, I mean, these taxes by Parliament were truly awful in so many ways because they weren't even effective in bringing in money. Not only were they driving the colonists away from them to start a war and create their own country, but get this, the Townshend Act only collected £260 for the crown. Let that sink in. It collected £260 for the crown, while it cost the crown £170,000 to enforce it. So it was incredible at how ineffective many of these taxes were. Eventually, Britain decided to suspend the Townshend Acts because the colonists boycotted British goods and colonial solidarity was forming at this time. The Crown shut down the New York Assembly after the Mutiny Act was passed, and they stationed troops in Boston, which leads us to the event on March 5th, 1770. Hopefully some of you out there who are listening to this know what I'm about to talk about, and that is the Boston Massacre, in which 5 colonists were found dead, and this was a propaganda tool for the colonists that was highly effective. And, you know, we talked about Paul Revere's depiction of this event, and if you just Google it, Paul Revere Boston Massacre, you'll be able to see it. And I mean, it is so blatantly propagandized and very effective. And there began to be a coalescence of colonial rebels around this cause against the Crown and against Parliament following the Boston Massacre. The Committees of Correspondence was passed, and ideas of revolution began to spread. Separation of powers were written up by various colonial governments, and they began to talk about ideas of checks on power. and representation and taxation arguments, right? No taxation without representation. And many of these colonists said, screw virtual representation. We want actual representation. This is not fair. This is unacceptable. Taverns and churches all throughout New England were places of radicalism, and these ideas began to spread more and more. 3.5 years after the Boston Massacre, remember, 3.5 years passed, and we, of course, detailed these in various episodes on this podcast. In December 16th of 1773, you have the Boston Tea Party. Parliament had passed the Tea Act, which was designed to help the East India Company by making the sale of its tea cheaper in America and more or less begin to create a monopoly, and the colonists were not happy, throwing the tea overboard into the Boston Harbor, which infuriated King George. Even though, technically, it was not King George's property. That's something that people often say. That's not accurate. It was private property. He could not believe the actions that were executed by the colonists, and Parliament really couldn't believe it either. This was like purely rebellious child critical parent mode. The colonists threw the tea over, and Parliament and the king shut down the port of Boston through the passage of the Coercive or the Intolerable Acts. They shut the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. They sent more troops into Boston, and they said that accused officials of crimes had to be tried in England, not America, which meant that they pretty much have free reign to do what they want, knowing that they wouldn't really be punished for it. The Massachusetts government was restructured. The army was authorized to quarter troops wherever they needed in Massachusetts. In the end, acts like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Declaratory Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Act, and the Coercive Act all led to a boiling of tensions between the colonists and Parliament and the king. The committees of correspondence, led by men such as Sam Adams, continued to keep communication alive between the colonists in the South, the Chesapeake region, and in the Middle Colonies and New England. In 1774, where we left off in this podcast, the First Continental Congress was formed, where they rejected a plan for colonial union under British authority, but did offer a statement of grievances, agreed to a series of boycotts, and said that they would meet the following spring in 1775, May of 1775. Next week, as we continue to prep for the series on the American Revolution, Bill will join me to have an extra cred episode. It will be called the What's What of the American Revolution. And we will do a broad, sweeping overview of the events of the American Revolution to provide you context for the conflict, and so you have some background and foundational knowledge heading into our episodes on the American Revolution. I know I threw a lot of information at you in this review podcast. I am actually sort of exhausted now that I've gone through all of it, so I know you're probably tired listening to it. So we will end it here, and I hope this was helpful. Please provide me feedback on these review episodes. Like I said, we'll do them a little bit more often, but a lot of this stuff you probably forgot. So hopefully this was a nice refresher for you. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Like I mentioned, by next episode, we will have a Patreon page up, and we will be giving you more details on the Patreon page. If you'd like to raise your hand, participate, please feel free to reach out to me, chris@theteachershistory.com. Find me on Twitter @theteachershist, Facebook, Teachers History Podcast. And if you could leave a rating and review on iTunes, that would mean a ton to myself, Bill, and Zach. Thanks so much.